Thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is, so we can go ahead and pop to the next slide. Hi, everyone. My name is Katie Martin Lightfoot. As Sandy said, I'm the Census Community Engagement Coordinator at the Center for Public Policy Priorities, but I also help coordinate the Texas Counts campaign. On the next slide, today I want to talk about why the count still matters for our state. So on the next slide, I know that many of us are probably familiar about why the census is so important to the state of Texas, and I know we're going to talk a little bit about the redistricting process, but you can really pop it into three different categories. The first being our voice, our quality of life, and our businesses. On the next slide. When we think about our voice, the census determines our representation in Congress, our electoral college votes, and it also informs redistricting. And so when we think about our political representation at the local level, but also at the federal level, it's really important to make sure that we have an accurate count. On the next slide. We also know that our businesses and our communities rely on census data, and they use this information for market research, where to set up shop, but also it can increase economic development in our communities. On the next slide. One of the most, arguably one of the most important things when we think about the census is that the census informs the distribution of federal funds to the state of Texas. And so when we're looking specifically at where these federal dollars are going, you can see a big chunk of those are going to Medicaid, Medicare, SNAP, highway planning, but all of these dollars are based off of the census data because that's, again, informing those dollars coming back to our state. So it's really important to have an accurate count. On the next slide. We all know that we are in a really difficult time right now with COVID-19. And so one thing that I really wanted to bring awareness to is that many of the resources that working folks and families across across our state that are relying on in the wake of coronavirus due to illness or job loss or ongoing need are directed by census data. So again, that includes our workforce assistance programs, healthcare, food assistance, disability services. These are all programs that our communities are relying on right now. And again, it's really important to make sure that we have an accurate count so we're not losing valuable dollars in our communities. On the next slide. This is our scary number. So in the state of Texas, if we are undercounted by 1%, we will lose $300 million per year for the next decade. So that means each year $300 million is coming out of our community. So it's coming out of our schools, out of our healthcare systems, out of the services, again, our communities need to thrive. My little asterisk there shows us that this is a conservative estimate. So again, it's really, really important to make sure that we have an accurate count in Texas so our communities are getting that funding we need to thrive. On the next slide. I want to talk a little bit about the hard to count, and Lila spoke a little bit about this in her opening presentation and remarks. So on the next slide, in the state of Texas, or let me back up a little bit, what does hard to count even mean? So hard to count means a region or a population with a low self-response in past census counts. And so when we think about specific populations for hard to count, that's our kiddos under 5, immigrants, people of color, families that move frequently, college students, non-English speaking communities, low-income households, people in rural areas, renters, as well as folks in complex households. So think about single-led households, or if there's multiple families living in a unit. I know that these characteristics, these families, these individuals are in all of our communities. And so when we think about, again, the importance of getting folks counted and folks that have been hard to count in previous censuses, it's really important to get out that message. On the next slide. I wanted to show kind of geographically where these hard to count populations are. So 25% of the population in Texas, or 1 in 4 Texans, lives in a hard to count community or area. As you can see, these darker red colors, orange colors, that they have high populations of hard to count people. But also in these counties that have white, don't think that there aren't folks that are hard to count in those areas, because we know that there's kiddos under 5. We know that there's people of color there. We know that there's renters there as well. So again, it's really important to make sure that we're making sure that everyone in the state of Texas is counted. On the next slide. One thing I wanted to share was kind of how Texas is doing in terms of self-response. And I imagine Lila can probably speak to this as well in the Q&A section. But I wanted to put together our hard to count map as well as our current self-response rate. map in Texas. So as of yesterday, 54.3% of Texans had responded to the census, and our households that have been invited to fill out the census have filled out the questionnaire. And so when we look at those blue areas, that means that we're doing good in terms of self-response. We're over that 50% mark. Darker blue means we're doing better. But again, when we start looking at those darker oranges and brown colors, that's where self-response hasn't been as high as we would like it to be. And it's really interesting to look at these two maps together because, again, where those hard to count communities are, we're also seeing some low self-response rates in those areas as well. So again, it's critical to make sure that we're pushing the message about filling out the census questionnaire to folks across the state of Texas. On the next slide. I want to talk a little bit about why so we know the census is important. We know that there are folks in our state that are hard to count, and only a little over half of our state has been counted in the census. And I want to talk about why it's so important to continue the count. On the next slide. When we think about traditional get out the count efforts, this means when we're sharing about the importance of filling out the census, there's kind of an official, unofficial outreach formula. And that means that we have get out the count resources and materials, and we're putting those in the hands of trusted voices. And they're sharing out to communities about why it is so important to fill out the census questionnaire. And so all of those great materials combined with trusted voices in our communities means that all Texans are counted. On the next slide. When we think about trying to get out the count during a pandemic, counting folks is really hard. Prior to COVID-19 and the restrictions that were put in place by our local governments and by the state of Texas, census champions across the state had plans to do these really great in-person events. So meaning after a service at a place of worship, they were going to set up a table and have folks fill out the census questionnaire, or maybe going through a more rural community or colonia and knocking on doors and reminding families to fill out a census questionnaire. At this time, we still know that it might not be safest to be out in communities and doing this really thoughtful, robust outreach effort. And so folks that are engaging in this work have really had to pivot and think about how they can really reach these communities that are hard to count. And so when we think about what folks are worried about, Lila and I actually do a weekly update call with census folks across the state. And we surveyed them to see what concerns they have about getting out the count, given that the census deadline has moved to October 31st. And a lot of them are really worried about losing that momentum externally. So when we think about telling our communities to fill out the questionnaire, but they're also worried about losing momentum internally. So many of us in this work were planning on wrapping things up in July or in August. And now with this extended deadline, we're having to rethink, how are we going to pay for this? Do we still have an audience to engage? But again, we know how important it is to make sure everyone in our state is counted. So we have to keep pushing the message that folks should be responding to the census. And then of course, last but not least, people are concerned about keeping their community safe and what kind of strategies we can actually implement during these times. On the next slide. I wanted to share out just some examples of how folks have pivoted their strategies in terms of going from those in-person events to more online activities. So we know phone banking, social media, providing materials to essential locations. And I know that we have some folks on the line who will talk a little bit more specifically about how they pivoted their outreach. But a big ask is with local media. So on the next slide. We know that folks are tuning in to media right now. Media consumption is up across all platforms. We know that folks are tuning into national news sources, but we also know that they're tuning into local news or ethnic media sources as well. So again, it shows that people are tuning in, they're trying to get the latest information. And so you as journalists and media folks, if you can start sprinkling in some census messaging about the importance to fill it out, we could really have a huge impact in terms of getting folks across the state to complete the questionnaire. And on the last slide, just in terms of messaging, of course, it's not too late to complete your 2020 census. It's never been easier to respond on your own, whether online, over the phone, or by mail, all without having to meet a census taker in person. And then on my actual last slide, In terms, if you're interested in kind of keeping up to date on all things census, this is where you can find us in terms of a weekly update to hear the latest about what's happening in the state of Texas. But we are also planning to do a big media push, a big collective impact, recreating some energy around filling out the census questionnaire with a virtual census road trip that I'm happy to talk more about. But that's all I got. So thanks, y'all.